Hello, my name is EJ Dawson, and this is my reading of my novel, Behind the Veil. Chapter 1. Michael's time was short. Breath wheezed over his dry tongue and down the phlegm-filled throat, squeezing into his lungs with spikes of breathlessness. Dulled under the doctor's ministrations, the seizures were increasing. They couldn't stop the swift attacks or save his life. But they ensured that he wasn't in any pain. He couldn't feel anything at all, not even where his wife held his hand between palms that gave no warmth. Heat came instead from the great roaring fireplace, which kept the snowflake chill at bay. He'd asked for the curtains to be left open so he could see the snowfall. The children loved snow. Their blue eyes were wide with trembling tears as they stood at the end of the bed. They ignored the snow to stare at him, swamped with sadness they did not understand, and Michael ached to reassure them. He smiled, remembering how they'd been last year, bursting with wonder and cheeky delight at the wrapped packages under the tree. This was no time of year to die in front of one's offsprings. Michael's one regret. "Please," his mother begged, "don't go. Don't leave us. It can't be you. You're all I have left." She held his other hand, hers clawed with age but gentle. Her weathered face bore the marks of tragedy: a lost husband, 2 lost sons. At least the others had been the line of duty as honourable deaths in the Great War. Michael couldn't imagine going to greet them in the beyond because he'd caught a chill. "Don't fret," he mouthed the words, unable to give them sound with the breath left in his body. "I'll tell them you love them." He tried to promise her, but she sobbed harder at his voiceless assurances. The children darted their eyes between him and their grandmother. When her wails became too much, his wife signalled a maid to usher the silent children away. Michael didn't want them to go. He needed them to be the last sight his dying eyes withheld. Their blonde heads turned away, white bedgowns fading to blurs in his weakening vision. Michael tried to call their names, but his utterance turned into a cough that left him gasping as he shuddered, agony rising to the surface again. "Doctor," his wife murmured, "please, is he suffering?" The doctor and nurses struggled to hold him as the seizure took him. Excruciating seconds dragged on as they jabbed the syringe into his arm, which pierced him like a blade. It hurt, it hurt, it hurt. Yet not as much as the pain in his chest and throat that climbed to his tongue and teeth. God, even his teeth ached. The drug slithered through his system, and Michael was so used to its soporific effect that it was a welcome balm. He'd die soon. Essence and thoughts slipping away as his vision narrowed on his wife. Her pale face was masked by the fine coating of powder clinging to her skin, eyes brimming not with sorrow but relief. He knew her so well. For the years she'd done a wife's duty, bore his children and taken care of his home. But she was young, younger than him. It was at her insistence he walked home that rainy day, and she hadn't called a doctor when sickness claimed him. She'd always thought him weak, and now she'd inherit it all on behalf of his son. He didn't fear for himself any longer, but he wished he wasn't leaving his children with her. Even as the light faded, all he could think of was their enormous innocent eyes, compared to the cool indifference of his wife. Letitia inhaled, coming out of the reverie as she avoided the final moments of Michael's death. His spirit slipped through the veil beyond, and she, a solitary witness to his passing, which had not been without regret. He carried the ache to protect his children, but he could stay no longer. They would have to fend for themselves. "He died on Christmas Day," she said, whisper soft, her own throat raw. "How sad for you." Letitia uttered it without thought and regretted it being so careless. "My son," the black-clad woman at the table wept, bringing Letitia back to the candlelit room. Her head spun with the vision's after-effects. Placing her hand flat on the table, she grounded herself, touching the cool walnut surface, concentrating on the whorls in the wood and ignoring the other things on the table. Her gaze drifted to the carpet, thick wool threaded in a Turkish pattern of cream vines swirling on a black background, red blossoms adorning their branches. and then across to the candelabra of wrought iron holding aloft 6 fat white candles, a measure of lost time given how far they'd burnt down. It shouldn't have been such a long session, but the man's death had dragged on for days, though Letitia's experience flashed by in a mere 20 minutes. Too long, Letitia thought, before focusing on the sobbing patron. The older woman was Michael's mother, Miss Peabody, and Letitia could see what made him a devoted son. Grey hair in a severe bun, the hands clawed from arthritis and some other muscular tension, the dark eyes so piercing in their pale face. But his mother brimmed with kindness and love, and was bereft without her family. It was the dainty woman beside Miss Peabody who was the viper here. Cold blue eyes stared at Letitia, who could read the disdain in the wife's face just as she could sense the edge of her emotions. Letitia's abilities allowed her to experience the wife's personality in the form of elemental conditions, a crisp breeze on her face, icy and unpleasant. Letitia focused instead on the reddened eyes of the mother. I saw him, in a bed. The fire was going, but Michael wanted the window open to see the snowfall. Letitia used the room's description to confirm her vision. You have 3 grandchildren, 2 girls and 1 boy. Blue eyes like their mother, but they have their father's blonde hair. He had pneumonia and passed away last Christmas. Michael wished he hadn't died in such a fashion, not compared to his brothers or his father. He wanted to have been brave like them. Her verdict set off Mrs. Peabody. The old woman's grief flooded Letitia in a profound sense of rain, falling without cease. The wife's unsympathetic gaze narrowed again, and Letitia ignored it. Whether the watchfulness came from suspecting Letitia's perception of the wife's unhappy marriage or disbelieving of Letitia's gift, it didn't matter. Letitia cared for her patron, Mrs. Peabody. Ma'am, Letitia said, using the American preferred manner of address, please don't distress yourself. Your son may have died before his time, but his last thoughts were of his family. He has gone to join the rest beyond the veil, and pass with no real regrets but that he left his children behind. A small lie that admitted his fear of his wife's intentions, but it didn't matter if it would comfort Mrs. Peabody. Letitia laid a gloved hand on the older woman's, and the mother accepted, squeezing it as much as she could with her fingers the way they were, crooked and disconcerting with their long nails. Could you please look for my husband, she pleaded, or even my other sons? I'm sorry, Letitia said, drawing her hand back, but reading between the veil of life and death exhausts me. You may book another session if you wish. She let the invitation drift, not reaching for an appointment book. They'd have to wait a week to see her, even though she'd arrived in Los Angeles months before. Despite the other few spiritualists lurking within the city, Letitia's reputation was taking care of itself. But she would have to take care to avoid the kind of trouble she'd found in England. She was no charlatan with her parlour tricks, or spiritualist with little training who would lead them astray. Please, whenever you can fit us in, money is no issue, Mrs. Peabody begged as the wife pouted. Ease the pain of my grief. All I have in the world is my grandchildren and this beautiful woman my son called wife. Letitia picked up her ledger, ignoring the protests forming on the wife's parting lips, and noted down a time next Tuesday evening. Mrs. Peabody accepted, and Letitia penciled in the date, time and name. Thank you so much, Mrs. Peabody said, repeating thanks as Letitia ushered them out. The wife still bore a delicate scowl on her sculpted brow, pausing as though about to say something. Letitia met her gaze, unperturbed, and the wife appeared to think better of it, and helped her mother-in-law down the stairs. Letitia closed the door behind them. With a sigh, she snapped on the electric lights, grateful they were in a city more civilized than the poorer parts of London. Taking the veil off, she straightened the black lace that rendered her face unrecognizable. Patrons could see the vague features through the gauze, but little else, and Letitia preferred it that way. It kept an element of mystery about her, and she was less identifiable should she run into a client. The marks of her past were distinctive enough to be recognizable. She welcomed the anonymity of the veil and the distance it gave her from her client's distress. It was her words that mattered, the authority her voice and conviction of truth in what she said. Anything else would perhaps cause clients to think she was a fraud. She was the very essence protecting them from false spiritualists like the one that had led her down this dark path. A medium who convinced grieving war widows and mothers she could commune with their dead husbands and sons. Dying in glorious battles, serving their country, they returned home in a box. Nothing but a placating piece of paper and a scrap of medal to mark their contribution. It sickened her. Letitia brought the family's peace she would never see. Hanging the veil on the back of the apartment door, a prompt so she wouldn't forget to put it back on for her next session, Letitia took off her gloves and prepared to pack away the tools of her visions. The first had to be the scrying bowl, made of black glass. It was full to the brim with crystal clear water, a similar glass dish underneath to catch any spillage. Letitia took the brass elongated spoon and disturbed the oiled surface of the water. The swells fractured, breaking apart to reform and change shape, and she ignored the pictures within when she picked up the bowl. Nudging aside the curtain with her knee, she held the bowl and the dish with one hand so she could undo the latch and open the window. Cold air blew over her face, the chills shivering away any lingering fog from the session. With great care, Letitia emptied the bowl into the garden a story below. Oil-infused water sprinkled on the kitchen sage bush, and Letitia knew the shrub would cleanse any taint staining the water. Without closing the window, she let the breeze flow into the apartment to remove the musky scent of dragon's blood incense. Letitia bought it from the local Chinese market. She might be a stranger to them, but they knew her craft. It lay in the bowl in her hands, and she was careful to dry with soft cotton and put back in its special witch hazel box. She took a key from the pocket of the black brocade dress she always wore for such sessions and locked the box where it sat on a cupboard. The bowl was her most prized and dangerous possession, and the bitter memories of when she was without it swelled in her mind before she banished them. It didn't stop hairs pricking up on the back of her neck. A shudder sent skittering over her skin. With the window open, she hadn't sensed that the cool draught source came not from the window, but from the door. A man stood on the landing, top hat low over his shadowed face, his broad shoulders covered by a gentleman's cape filled the doorway. He waited for her, unmoving in his perusal. The intrusion outraged Letitia, as did the silent scrutiny and the indecency of opening her door without invitation. "How dare you? Please leave." She crossed the room intent on slamming the door shut. "I hear your skills are legitimate." The baritone of his voice only added to his ominous presence. Whatever fear he meant to instill in her fell flat in the face of her ire. "And you, sir," she gave the address with derision, "need no introduction to state your bad manners." "Forgive me," he bowed low, but not enough to take his eyes off her. "I didn't know that this was an apartment and not an office. I wanted to see what you would do after they left." Letitia guessed he wanted to see her face, as she always wore the veil, either when she went out with her hat, an acceptable social norm, or when she was with her patrons. Her patrons were wealthy. They had to be to afford her services, but she had to supply believable results, ones that would give closure to their grief. Letitia's familiarity with sorrow ran so deep there was seldom a misstep when she spoke to her patrons, voice full of consoling sympathy. Some, however, could become irate, forcing her to revert to the steely tones she'd once used as a schoolteacher. The same sternness returned now as she stared at the stranger. Long, narrow face, less handsome than it was striking. Eyes soft green as new spring leaves, but with a severity that contradicted any gentleness in him, along with thin lips and a raised brow. A glance at his ensemble, dark as it was, showed the glinting diamond pins surrounded by sapphires at his throat that was almost lost in the folds of black silk. He wore a matching wool waistcoat, silver pocket, and watch chain hanging from its buttons. His black-gloved hands rested on top of a large, thick cane, and would not surprise Letitia if within it was a sword. How passé. But Letitia could ill afford to offend him. "Now you've had your turn," he said with an amused quirk of his lips at her inspection. "Can we discuss business?" "I do not have more than one session a night," Letitia said, "and not without prior engagement. You will need to book an appointment." She turned on her heel, eyes drifting to the veil. He'd already seen her face, so it would draw attention to her fear to don it now. Crossing the room, she picked up the black leather appointment book on the sideboard and returned to the door. He hadn't moved, except where his gaze followed her movements. She pretended not to notice his examination as she read him. Letitia stretched her senses. His temperament formed a hot wind, the heat of a desert, pervasive and endless. It made her skin itch, and she fought not to scratch the bead of sweat gathering on her temple. Physical manifestation of her sensory perceptions was the sign of an overwhelming persona. Either that or a dramatic one, she thought as she scanned her entries for an availability. "Do you perform your sessions here?" he asked, and she nodded, scanning the book. The book denoted little over a week of appointments, but something made her keep turning the pages of days he couldn't see. The sensation of his personality on her skin hadn't abated. Whomever he looked for in the beyond may not wish to be found. She always investigated her patrons before performing a session. Death in wars was terrible, and accidents and sickness were far less traumatic, but carried intense grief and regret. The elderly were a rarity and passed in a confused peace. Murder was the one death she would not accept under any circumstances. The longer she stood there, the surer she became she didn't want to perform any services for him. "My apologies," Letitia said, hopeful she could put him off with an excuse. "I'll need a preliminary appointment and then a secondary one for the actual session, and I'm unavailable for another 3 weeks. I can't wait that long," he said, reaching into his suit pocket to pluck out a brown envelope. "If you require a provisional report to better assess the situation, you can come by my office in the morning, where I will have legal paperwork for matters of confidentiality. I believe most of your consultations are in the afternoon, so it should not interfere with your appointment book." Letitia snapped the ledger shut. "I have other errands I must attend to tomorrow. I wasn't asking you, Miss Hawking." She had guessed he'd spoken to one of her patrons, which would explain his presence on her doorstep, but now she was certain. Only during private consultations did she give her name, and only to those who treated what she gave them with the due dignity. All clients had to meet her conditions, and each made a substantial payment for her service. It varied on the time passed and the trauma of death, but each one carried a price for them and for her. Letitia always finished her sessions by asking patrons for their discretion and giving out a card with a telephone number and times to call. She was happy for a client to refer her to others, but rather than call, he was here in person making demands. He was not the kind of clientele she sought, especially one connected to a patron who had broken her request for privacy. "I don't appreciate your tone of voice," she retorted, "or opening my door without invitation like a common thief. Never mind that you haven't bothered to introduce yourself." "I believe I've already apologized for my error," he said, and Letitia would have responded in kind, but he was instructing her again. "And under the circumstances of your profession, I'm being more than reasonable in my request, as well as my reimbursement for your time." He attempted to hand her the envelope, and when she didn't accept, he dropped it where she still held the ledger. It brushed her bare fingers, and a shadow grew behind the stranger. The captivating dark absorbed her being. Letitia fumbled for mental defences against a true apparition, stunned as she was by its vivid form. A cloud of darkness, without face or features, hovered over the man's shoulder, but deep inside it, she sensed it staring at her. Broad arms that could have grasped her in its embrace lay by its side. Letitia couldn't draw breath to scream at the darkness within the figure, the soul-sucking despair rendering her voiceless at the shadow's presence. Before she could gather her wits, the stranger left with a swell of his cloak, and the figure vanished. I hope you enjoy. Please find my book on my website, ejdawson.com.